we're excited to have Nathaniel Gurien, who has been working on cannabis banking solutions, traditional banking and merchant services. This issue has plagued the industry for a very long time. Nathaniel, thank you for joining us.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Now, all we have to do is see
There
if
you
I'm
are.
actually able to do a screen share on some slides that we have. And if I can, we'll have the benefit of that. Let's see.
Fantastic.
Would be this thing.
So how's New York?
Um, you know, New York is boring. It's basically going through the motions of day-to-day living, and paying New York City rent and prices without the New York City part. And to the extent that people are stepping out, they're stepping into a little bit more increased risk and hazard. So, but everybody's getting pretty squirrely. I know from my point of view, I've noticed over the last year that it just feels like just a part of my spiritual social self is atrophying, and I just sort of feel the effect of it. And I think a lot of folks probably are feeling the same thing, and yet I don't want to take undue risks. One of the biggest tragedies would probably be one of the last soldiers killed in the war, so to speak. So we're still being cautious, and we're hoping to get back to in-person conferences and stuff in the fall. So
until then, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing some hope. Just this past week, I've heard from another company that I'm associated with through business networking, and they've lost their bank account. So please tell us what your company does and how your company can be of assistance.
All right, well, let's see. Slide number 2. Let's see if that actually works. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, one of the things is it's really important in trying to overcome a challenge or solve a problem to understand what the nub of the problem is. And For very long, people have felt that it is federal restrictions on cannabis banking that have stood in the way. And the bankers and the financial industry have been perpetuating and putting out this pretext for quite a long time. And so a lot of folks are putting a lot of time and energy into trying to solve a problem um, that with the solutions that are in search of a problem. And we discovered, uh, Fincann and I got into looking into overcoming the challenges of facing people trying to get compliant and sustainable banking for roughly 5 years now. And early in the process, um, it it became obvious to us that the nub of the problem was not the federal restrictions, but the fact that bankers come generally, especially at the C level and at the board level, um, are fairly what I would describe as mainstream conservative, and that leads them to basically feel that this is a deplorable and shady business, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. The more we say to them, well, but it's not like heroin, and it's not like meth, and it's not like other things like that, the more they immediately fall back on their preconceived ideas that it's a gateway drug to those things, and they picture their kids with a needle in their arm in the back of a schoolyard somewhere. And this all happens on the, kind of the impulsive level. And they have a revulsion to doing business with the industry. They don't have that same type of concern about other quote unquote high risk industries, especially ones which are cash intensive, like check cashing services and casinos firearms dealers, stuff like that. They don't have that type of visceral, hysterical reaction, but they do to cannabis, and that underlies all of the resistance that they have put up to providing simple and basic financial services like a checking account and merchant processing and some lending to qualified borrowers and so on. Um, I can only imagine if the public utility companies providing electric just decided to take the same position. They're more or less federally regulated. They could have fallen back on that, and I think that our whole industry would have been stillborn if we did not have electricity. Thankfully, they didn't take that position, but the bankers do, and so we had some interesting experiences a number of years ago, early on, that allowed us to understand that their emotional um, reaction and misunderstanding of the business um, is what was the nub of the problem. One situation that I had early on that was very instructive is I had a client, a licensee in Nevada about 4 years ago, looking for compliant banking. And I contacted every single one of the guests that they open an account for my client, but I'll come in and make a complimentary presentation on the risks and opportunities of banking the industry, just so that they would have a background and some good understanding when and if they wanted to make any decisions with regard to it. And not one of them would even take the meeting to get any information. They were not interested. Um, and also, early on, about 4.5 or 5 years ago, I decided that it would be very important not to just come from the perspective of being a cannabis industry professional, but that I also had to wear something of a banking and anti-money laundering compliance hat also. So I joined the appropriate banking trade associations and learned and studied and took a lot of courses and got credentialed in it so that I could not only be able to speak with them as a colleague and have credibility, but also to understand what was behind it. Because I think that it's very, very difficult to understand this core problem without having a knowledge of what goes on behind the scenes in banking. Um, and once we realized that that was the issue that we had to work against, um, it got a lot easier to solve the problem because now it was not a matter of presenting arguments and facts. It was a matter of changing how people feel. And one of the pioneers in cannabis banking a number of years ago was able to gain an important foothold in developing a sustainable cannabis banking program by approaching it not from making a judgment pro or con regarding cannabis, but to decide that it was really a matter of protecting the community from being awash in untracked, possibly criminal cash, and to bank that money and to be able to report it and to supervise it was going to be a very, very important community service, um, and would also provide and defend against a very unsafe and potentially chaotic situation of communities suddenly being awash in untracked cash. So that was extremely helpful in getting to the nub of the problem and allowed us to talk to banks in a way which they were better able to respond to. The net result is by focusing on building those relationships one at a time, by educating the banks, by stoking their interest, and to giving them the tools and resources to look at it a little more dispassionately. We've been able to build up over the last 5 years a network of roughly 200 banks around the country that are industry friendly. Not every bank supports every single sector, but between them, At least a third of them, a little bit more, are THC licensee friendly. Others are friendly to CBD and hemp and investment funds and ancillaries, and so on. And so Fincann is now in a position where there actually is no longer an industry banking problem. Um, we now have sufficient banking relationships that anyone across any sector in the industry, across all 50 states, can now have a compliant, transparent um, business checking account and partnership with their bank, and access to either retail B2C or wholesale B2B electronic payment processing, um, lending service lending, where the private lenders are being able to come in at very close to bank lending rates. So things are improving significantly. And our real challenge now is to close the information gap between what people feel that there's still a major problem having access to banks, and the fact that, in fact, through FinCann's Cannabis Banking Financial Network, we can provide anybody with a real bank account, and not by that I mean not necessarily a banking solution. We have some colleagues who do offer that, and in some situations that's appropriate, where it's kind of a managed account, through an account executive, kind of a custodial account. But the overwhelming majority of the bank accounts that we help people open are with actual real banks that you can go visit. Um, the biggest problem has been, because the banks have been unwilling to support the industry, um, people in the industry have been obliged either to operate entirely in cash, which is very expensive and risky. You have to guard against, you have to be very careful counting the money. You have to keep it secure. You've got issues of internal security, external security when you're transporting it, either to a supplier or to the bank or to the state to pay taxes. Um, and there's just lots of problems with being forced to operate in cash. And so a lot of folks in the industry have tried to find ways to work around that. And one of the things that people have done is to open up a bank account under a non-cannabis company name and to make their deposits through that. Um, and it's almost kind of become a cliche in the industry that a lot of folks will open accounts like this, and part of the burden and challenge of being a cannabis THC licensee is that you're going to expect to have to change banks and bank accounts 3 or 4 times a year, and that's a major inconvenience and pain point. But people were kind of doing it. Now, with more access to banking, people are doing that less, although it's still a prevalent practice in our industry. And also, about 2 years ago, some people have been basically coming up with. Let me backtrack 1 second. Um, One of the banking services that people very much need, in addition, that are really fundamental, that um, are another. It's almost as fundamental as having a checking account, is being able to accept credit cards for retail sales and deliveries. And the card networks have basically taken the arbitrary position as a private business, just like the banks, that they choose not to support cannabis transactions on the pretext that, since they're still federally illegal, therefore it is an illegal product that is being offered, and that violates their terms of service. So folks have tried to find clever and often very ingenious and very technically advanced workarounds to try to find a way to allow people to accept major cards and still have a sustainable program. And we've seen many of them. We've partnered with them. We've tried to help them with banking issues, um, but they've all collapsed after a few months um, because of one problem or another, mostly related to the fact that in order for them to work, one or more of the stakeholders in the payment processing chain was not being told the truth about it being a cannabis transaction. And when they find out, they shut the thing down. The point here is that we may have a very serious problem that the industry that's developing in the industry, and that is that there's a credit card or debit card based solution called the cashless ATM, which without getting into a lot of detail as to how it operates, um, although it's attractive, and that up until about 6 weeks ago, there was an assumption that the worst case scenario was that it would be shut down and it would be inconvenient, and then you wouldn't be able to accept cards anymore for payment and so on. But it was probably worth the treading in the gray area because for 3 or 6 months you'd be able to accept cards, and that was a big advantage to your business in terms of doing more sales and in terms of cutting down on the cash and all the risk and expense of that. um, and the problem here is that with the recent U.S. attorney's prosecution of the delivery company Ease and several of its personnel, in which um, the ex-CEO of Ease pled guilty to bank fraud for basically doing that exact thing of um, opening up bank accounts or merchant accounts under a non-cannabis name and running cannabis proceeds through it, as well as several of his collaborators who he worked with who have recently, I think it was about a week ago, their trial concluded and they were found guilty of bank fraud. And now there's buzz in the legal and banking and law enforcement um, channels that they're starting to take a closer look at this. And now it looks like anybody who has a bank account that is not transparent, that is deceiving the bank as to the true nature of the transactions, um, and whether it's on a merchant processing level or a bank depository level, it's not going to take a whole lot for a junior U.S. attorney to take a look at the thing that if it's worth making a whole federal bank fraud case out of a few fellows, how tempting a target might it be to their ambition to go after thousands and thousands of cannabis licensees over the last 10 years, especially those who are still engaging in these type of practices. So I'm actually, my hair's kind of on fire about this, because I'm really afraid that, this, with people continuing to do this, especially, even if the only alternative is to do business in cash, which it's not, because certainly, at least with Fincann, anybody can get a bank account at this point. But even in the absence of that, um, I would put as much distance from those type of fraudulent activities at this point, because now it may not actually just be a matter of inconvenience. One may actually be putting oneself at real risk. Um, so basically, with the merchant processing, because Visa, Mastercard, Amex, and Discover have taken the position that they have, it's very difficult to get good merchant processing. And there are about 7 or 8 solutions out there that have provided electronic payments through an ACH debit on your bank checking account. And the thing about this is that they work and that they're compliant, but they're burdensome, especially for the consumer, because, for example, you walk into a dispensary and you you have your smartphone, and they say, hey, you don't have to pay in cash. You can just download this app, and you can put in all your personal information, including your social security number and your driver's license number and your bank account online credentials, so that the app can get into your bank account and see how much money you have and all the rest of this. And long before most people, long before they're willing to go through this whole process in the dispensary, um, just say, forget about this. I just came in here to buy a bag of weed. I'll just go out to the ATM, take out the money, and pay you, and get on my way. I don't really want to try to understand, whether it's okay to put my personal information into this app, and it's not really doing me any service. So they have a lot of trouble getting people to adopt that solution. Recently, we have been working with a couple of cannabis compliant banks that have a pretty good solution for now. One is a cannabis compliant bank that is sponsoring the use of debit cards. And that would be MasterCard, Visa, and Discover debit cards, as well as ATM cards that run on the debit networks. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of a dozen or a little more than that debit networks um, that are not that are not don't run on the credit card rails, and so they're basically a banking transaction. And this bank is sponsoring and taking on all the risk and filing all of the necessary documents with the feds and supervising the transactions very carefully. And you can only settle into a compliant, certified, verified um, uh, cannabis compliant bank account, and so on. And that's kind of a tasty solution, because it's basically going to be the same kind of merchant account that you would have post legalization, when and in fact, once we have legalization or descheduling, we'd expect within a few months the card networks would permit credit card sales, and so all we'd have to do is flip a switch on the existing terminal that was taking debit cards, and then it would take everything for roughly the same price. So that's very exciting, because it's the beginnings of just conventional, traditional um, merchant processing. And a lot of what goes on in this industry is um, that we take complicated workarounds to try to solve a problem. But ultimately, the sustainable solution is just a simple, normal business checking account at a real bank, and a simple, normal merchant processing um, account with a merchant processing company. And so we've achieved that. We do have one ACH solution that's also supported by a cannabis compliant bank called Express ACH, and that's designed for e-commerce, for some of these online platforms where you can order a whole range of stuff, and then you pay for it, and you can either go to the dispensary and pick it up, or they'll deliver it to you. And in that case, you can't use a debit card and put in your PIN number. It doesn't work that way. So in this case, this is just a button on your shopping cart. And all you have to do is put in your checking account number and bank routing number, no other information, and it automatically just charges your account for whatever the sale is, and it goes through. So those are the kind of solutions we have for merchant processing. And I'll just mention a couple of important myths about cannabis banking, because one of the missions of Fincann is to push back against the enormous amount of misinformation and lack of information that is rife in this particular sector. The first one is that a lot of folks get up on panel discussions and make presentations and say that there are roughly 700 banks working with the cannabis industry right now. And that's based on a complete misinterpretation of a Treasury Department report on how many banks have filed marijuana related, what they call suspicious activity reports. The problem with that is that at least half of those suspicious activity reports are banks reporting that they discovered somebody who had an account under some name that was actually a cannabis dispensary or a cultivator or something, and they immediately closed the account. Now, that would not really be a very good example of somebody banking the industry. And a number of others are these reports that are filed by banks where they might have discovered that one of their customers who runs shopping strips has now rented one of their units to a dispensary. And so they file a report for that. Now, The Treasury Department doesn't want to see those reports, but the banks file them. So now they'll go on the list as a bank that might be, that's filing marijuana-related reports and counts as a bank that's doing business with the industry, when really they're not. They're just accommodating, one customer who is several steps removed from it. The other thing I think that's a very important takeaway is that that there are federal restrictions on cannabis banking. That's a myth. Since 2014 and since some Treasury Department guidances have come out, banks have been banking the industry and have been passing their examinations, and no bank has lost their insurance or got into any type of criminal or civil liability for banking the industry. Yet, because the banks do not wish to admit that it is basically just prejudice and misinformation which is preventing them from supporting the industry, um, and have created a tremendous amount of dust and smoke over the idea that if only the feds would take off the handcuffs, they'd be willing to go ahead. A lot of folks are focusing on things like the Safe Banking Act, which basically doesn't do anything. Or it certainly doesn't do anything that it was directly intended to do, because the core that it says is that federal bank examiners are prohibited from sanctioning banks because they're doing business with the cannabis industry. Um, and the problem with that is that they don't sanction banks for doing business with the cannabis industry. I had a conversation on the record with a fellow named David Carr, who's communications director for the FDIC several years ago. And I asked him, what's the FDIC's policy on cannabis banking? And he said, look, just follow the standard anti-money laundering examination manual that all examiners and banks are subject to, and also appended to with the Treasury Department guidance from 2014. And if a bank is in compliance with that, we're perfectly okay with it. And this has been reiterated by all of the regulatory agencies. So the Safe Banking Act, for example, is clearly a solution searching for a problem. The actual problem is that the banks are reluctant to do business with the industry. Although over the last few years, as a result of a lot of efforts on both our part as well as many of our colleagues who are doing a lot of the same work, as well as the fact that there is a lot more mainstream acceptance for cannabis, the banks are loosening up and beginning to look at it as more of an opportunity rather than a risk to be avoided. One of the things is partly because of this type of misinformation, the Fincann website has been designed as kind of an encyclopedia resource for the industry and for any stakeholders to get clear, solid, detailed information on cannabis banking and payments and a lot of the issues surrounding it. It's very rich in resources and regulatory information and opinions. But one of the kind of the easy and helpful utilities that we installed on the homepage is our official industry-friendly bank counter, where we actually give you the total number of banks that are currently banking the industry and broken down by sector. And you can register with your email to get real-time updates when those numbers change. And a lot of that is because part of the service we feel that we need to offer, because it's so desperately needed, is clear and accurate and complete information so people can make informed decisions. And so that's one of Fincann's missions. That having been said, perhaps some people have some questions, which is why we have this amazing slide that says questions. So please go ahead if anyone does.
Charles, I don't know if you are here. I would love to let you go first. If not, I do have some questions as well.
Well, if you like, I will go first.
Fantastic.
The main question that stood out to me, you were talking about people being used to being charged. I mean, having to change bank accounts 4 times a year. I'm curious if that's still the same with the banks that you have relationships with. If somebody goes in clearly knowing what they're doing and all, is there still a chance that you're going to have your bank account closed?
Well, the short answer is no. The reason that people's bank accounts were closed was because the bank was unaware of, some or all of what they were actually doing. They call themselves a management company or an LLC or a bicycle shop, and they're depositing cash. And at some point in time, the bank says, "What are you doing?" Or maybe they go take a look at their website, or maybe they do an address match and they say, "Gee, this is a dispensary address," or whatever. But people have lost their bank accounts, I would say 99.9% of the time, as a result of not being transparent with the bank. And especially early on, several years ago, there was almost no banking available. So it was either cash or deception. And again, deception seemed like a relatively innocuous inconvenience, although with events over the last couple of months, it looks like it might be a lot more risky than simply inconvenient.
And then my last question goes along with kind of the same thing on credit cards. If you start up a credit card account, they know what you're doing, maybe more with CBD in this case. Are you still running the risk of having your credit card account closed down? And if so, why?
Well, the thing is, transparency and compliance are the more of it you employ reasonably, the higher level of sustainability is your business and your relationships. If you go to a bank that might have been willing to take your CBD business account, and you don't tell them it's a CBD business account, they're likely to terminate your account because they feel that they can't trust you and who knows what else you're doing. But if you are working with a bank that in full partnership and full disclosure with what you're doing and the nature of your business, and they welcome and embrace that, then it's very rare that your account will be closed, and certainly not precipitously. And what I mean by that is, for example, there was a bank in Florida a couple of years ago that was cannabis friendly, and embraced their customers. But then they had a merger opportunity, an acquisition from a larger regional bank that wanted to basically acquire them, and the acquiring bank did not want to have the cannabis portfolio. But that bank worked with all of their customers to find another bank that they could move them to before they basically, they didn't unceremoniously, throw them out. So basically, the answer to your question is, if you're working with a bank that supports your particular sector, does the compliance that's necessary to support your bank account, you're only going to have an ever growing and better partnership, financial partnership with your bank, and when you need things, they'll understand your business and be able to help you as best they can. So it's very important at this point on many levels to have a transparent, compliant bank account where the right protocols are being employed, and then you really have nothing to worry about. In fact, you can get a normal bank account and normal merchant processing now, and put those two annoyances, and now you only have 98 other horrifying things to deal with in the cannabis industry. But at least those two things could be normal, and that's really what we're bringing to the community is normal banking and normal merchant processing and normal lending, and trying to get it to where it's just a regular utility and it's not some hysterical problem anymore.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
Jessica.
very much. Thank you, Nathaniel. We are out of time for questions and answers now, as it is time for us to move on to our next guest. I would like to thank you so very much for your time that you have spent with us today. And please share with our audience how they can best contact you.
Well, yeah, and it was my pleasure, to share with folks anything I can do to try to demystify this, because there's just so much misinformation out there, and people make decisions, but bad decisions on the basis of that. The easiest way to contact us is I'm very happy to speak to people directly. It's Nathaniel, Nathaniel, at Fincann.com. And our main company telephone number is 212-724-7777. And as an additional benefit, we actually answer that phone when you call it. So, that's kind of a nice thing.
That is a wonderful thing. Oh my gosh, what a novel idea. Actually
There
answering
you
the
go.
phone when you call.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
You're
Nathaniel.
welcome. My pleasure. Thanks for
Fincann.
inviting me.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.